Hello, and welcome to Day by Day True Crime Stories, the podcast where we explore a different crime or justice milestone from this day in history. I'm your host, Kona Gallagher, and today is March 2nd. On this day in 1978, one of the strangest cases of grave robbery ever recorded took place when Charlie Chaplin's remains were stolen. Yes, you heard that right. Just months after the legendary silent film star was laid to rest, thieves in Switzerland dug up his grave and stole his coffin in the dead of night. What followed was an international mystery filled with ransom demands, a police investigation straight out of a Hollywood script, and two criminals who clearly didn't think their plan through. So who was behind this bizarre crime and why did they do it? And perhaps most importantly, how did they think they were going to get away with it? Those are all the questions we're going to explore today, so let's get started. Charlie Chaplin was more than just a movie star. He was a cultural icon. Born in 1889 in London, England, he became one of the most recognizable figures in film history, thanks to his famous character, the Tramp. The Tramp was a lovable, cane-twirling, bowler hat-wearing vagabond. His impact on cinema was immeasurable, with classics like The Kid in 1921, City Lights in 1931, Modern Times in 1936, and, of course, The Great Dictator in 1940. But despite his Hollywood success, Chaplin's later years were complicated. By the 1950s, he was surrounded by political controversy. Accusations of communist sympathies led to the revocation of his U.S. visa, meaning that he wasn't allowed to return to America. Instead of fighting the decision, he decided to just stay gone. And he settled with his family in Coursier-sur-Vevey, Switzerland, where he lived the rest of his life out in peace. On December 25th, 1977, at the age of 88, Charlie Chaplin passed away in his sleep, surrounded by his wife, Una O'Neill Chaplin, and their children. His funeral was private, and he was buried in the quiet Coursier-sur-Vevey cemetery, which overlooked Lake Geneva. And that should have been his final resting place, but just a few months later, his peace was shockingly disturbed. On the morning of March 2nd, 1978, gravediggers arrived for their shift at the Coursier-sur-Vevey cemetery, only to discover something unbelievable. Charlie Chaplin's grave had been dug up and his coffin was gone. All that remained was a gaping hole in the ground. News of the theft, of course, spread quickly, leaving the Chaplin family, law enforcement, and the entire world in shock. Who on earth would steal the remains of one of the most famous men in film history? Police scoured the scene for clues, but the thieves had left behind almost no evidence. No fingerprints, no tools, and no clear trail to follow. The crime seemed both audacious and absurd. And no one was more baffled than Una Chaplin. When reporters asked her thoughts, she gave a response that perfectly captured her husband's spirit. Quote, "Charlie would have found this ridiculous," end quote. A few days after the theft, the phone rang at the Chaplin family home. On the other end was an anonymous caller. He had one demand: 600,000 Swiss francs, or about $2.6 million in today's money, in exchange for the return of Charlie Chaplin's remains. But Una Chaplin refused to entertain their demands. She didn't believe that Charlie would have wanted her to pay, and she wasn't about to be manipulated by criminals. Instead, she immediately contacted police, who launched an extensive investigation. Authorities were skeptical about the ransom calls. They suspected that the thieves weren't professionals because the way that they were handling the negotiations felt really amateurish to them. Over the next 5 weeks, police traced the ransom calls to various public phone booths around Lausanne, Switzerland, a city not far from Charlie's home. So detectives set up surveillance at the phone booths, hoping that the thieves would slip up. And finally, On May 17, 1978, their patience paid off. Police arrested two men, Roman Wardus, a 38-year-old Polish immigrant, and Goncho Ganev, a 24-year-old Bulgarian refugee. Their motive was simple. They wanted money. Wardus, the mastermind, had read about a case where ransom money was successfully paid for stolen remains. He figured that targeting someone as famous as Charlie Chaplin would give him and Ganev a huge payday. But their plan was flawed from the start. For one, digging up a grave is a lot harder than it seems. It reportedly took them hours to unearth the 350-pound coffin. They also failed to cover their tracks. Calling from public phone booths allowed police to trace their movements. They handled the ransom demands poorly as well, and their phone calls were erratic and unconvincing. When faced with overwhelming evidence, Wardus cracked. He confessed to everything and led authorities to the hidden location of Chaplin's coffin, a cornfield just a few miles away from the cemetery. By December 1978, Wardus and Ganev stood trial in a Swiss courtroom. Wardus, the mastermind, received a 4-year prison sentence. Ganev, who played a more minor role, got a suspended sentence and was later deported. In court, Wardus expressed regret, saying, quote, "I regret what I have done. I never intended to hurt anyone," end quote. But the judge made it clear disturbing the dead is a serious crime, especially when it involves an international icon. After the ordeal, Charlie Chaplin's coffin was reburied in Coursier-sur-Vevey Cemetery, this time under a thick layer of reinforced concrete, making sure that his rest would never be disturbed again. As for Una Chaplin, she never spoke publicly about the thieves again. She saw no reason to dwell on two desperate criminals who, in the end, got nothing from their scheme. The Chaplin family moved forward, preserving Charlie's legacy just as he would have wanted. And Una was right. Charlie Chaplin would have found this ridiculous. Even decades later, this remains one of the most bizarre grave robberies in history, but it did nothing to tarnish Charlie Chaplin's legacy. His films still bring laughter to millions, his influence on cinema remains unmatched, and his life story continues to inspire generations of artists. Thank you for joining me on today's episode of Day by Day True Crime Stories. If you found this episode compelling, please subscribe, rate, and review our podcast. And be sure to join me again tomorrow as we explore another significant event in true crime history. Until then, stay safe and remember that behind every headline is a life worth remembering. Day by Day, True Crime Stories is a Little Monster production.
Hey, you can do it!